There was like Hollywood resistance. People didn't like that you were making it.
There was a lot of opposition to it.
In 2004, The Passion of the Christ shocked audiences, divided critics, and quietly reshaped religious filmmaking. Years later, a single conversation between Mel Gibson and Joe Rogan reopened that wound and revealed something many people had missed. Why did this film face such intense resistance? Why did Gibson insist on telling the story this way, despite personal cost and industry backlash? And why did his reflection move one of the world's most outspoken podcast hosts to silence and tears? This is not just a story about a movie. It is about faith under pressure, truth that makes people uncomfortable, and the consequences of refusing to look away. When Mel Gibson sat down with Joe Rogan, the discussion did not feel like a promotional interview or a nostalgic look back at a famous film. It felt more like a reckoning. Gibson was not trying to defend the Passion of the Christ. He was explaining why making it changed him, and why the reaction to it revealed something uncomfortable about culture, faith, and power. Gibson described the film as a personal obligation rather than a career move. He made it independently, financed it himself, and accepted the possibility that it could end his standing in Hollywood. That decision alone tells us something important. In an industry built on risk management and mass approval, Gibson chose a story he knew would provoke resistance. He did not frame the suffering of Jesus in symbolic or softened terms. He showed it directly, physically, and relentlessly. Rogan's emotional reaction did not come from theological agreement. It came from recognizing the cost of that choice. Gibson spoke about suffering not as something to avoid, but as something that forces honesty. He suggested that constant comfort dulls self-examination, while pain strips away illusions. That idea struck Rogan deeply, not because it was religious language, but because it was human. What made this conversation powerful was its lack of performance. Gibson did not claim moral superiority. He admitted failure, doubt, and internal conflict. He talked about happiness as something shallow if it is never tested, and meaning as something forged through confrontation with discomfort. This was not a sermon, it was an admission. The interview also revealed why the film still unsettles people years later. The Passion of the Christ refuses distance. It does not allow viewers to treat the crucifixion as a distant myth or abstract symbol. It forces the audience to sit with violence, fear, betrayal, and silence. Many films about faith offer reassurance. This one offered confrontation. That, more than graphic imagery, explains the backlash. The film did not flatter modern sensibilities. It did not align neatly with cultural expectations of tolerance, optimism, or entertainment. Instead, it asked an older and more difficult question. What does it mean to face suffering without escaping it? This is where Gibson's reflection connects to Rogan's reaction. The moment that brought Rogan to tears was not about Jesus alone. It was about the cost of truth-telling in any form. Gibson described how people resisted the film not only because it was religious, but because it refused to dilute pain into something comfortable. In that sense, the resistance was predictable. This conversation matters because it reframes the film. It moves the focus away from controversy headlines and box office numbers and toward intention. Whether one believes the story religiously or not, the film represents a deliberate refusal to compromise. And that refusal, Gibson suggested, is why it continues to provoke strong reactions. Before examining the production struggles and institutional resistance, it is necessary to understand the film itself, not as a retelling of scripture, but as a deliberate artistic choice to confront suffering directly. That choice shaped everything that followed. To understand why The Passion of the Christ created such a strong reaction, it is important to understand what Mel Gibson was trying to do and what he deliberately refused to do. This film was never intended to be a full biography of Jesus. It does not explore his childhood, his teachings, or his public ministry in detail. Gibson made a narrow and difficult choice to focus almost entirely on the final hours of Jesus' life. That decision was not accidental. Gibson believed that the crucifixion is the emotional and theological center of Christianity. In his view, removing or softening the suffering weakens the meaning of sacrifice. He did not want viewers to admire Jesus from a safe distance. He wanted them to confront the cost of the story directly. The film draws primarily from the four Gospels, but it is not a verse-by-verse reenactment. Gibson combined scriptural accounts with traditional Christian imagery and interpretations to create a continuous emotional experience. His goal was not academic precision, it was moral weight. Every scene was designed to slow the viewer down and prevent detachment. The opening in Gethsemane sets the tone. Jesus is not calm or distant. He is visibly distressed, aware of what is coming, and struggling with fear and sorrow. This portrayal challenges common cinematic images of quiet, untouchable holiness. Instead, it presents vulnerability without removing dignity. That tension continues throughout the film. Violence in the movie has often been described as excessive, but Gibson argued that the brutality was the point. Historically, Roman executions were designed to humiliate and destroy. By showing the physical damage in detail, Gibson rejected the sanitized versions of suffering that are easier to consume. He wanted viewers to understand that crucifixion was not symbolic pain. It was real, degrading, and final. This approach explains why many audiences found the film difficult to watch. It does not provide emotional relief. There are few moments of comfort, humor, or escape. Even familiar moments, such as Peter's denial or Mary watching from a distance, are presented without dramatic exaggeration. They are quiet, restrained, and painful in their simplicity. Gibson also made a significant choice by using ancient languages, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Latin. This limited the film's commercial appeal but reinforced its seriousness. Viewers were forced to read subtitles and pay attention. The language barrier removed modern familiarity and emphasized historical distance, while the imagery pulled the audience back into emotional proximity. Another important element is how the film portrays power. Political and religious authorities are shown as cautious, fearful, and self-protective rather than openly evil. Pilate is not depicted as a monster, but as a man trapped between conscience and political pressure. Religious leaders are shown as divided, with some doubting the accusations but unwilling to risk their positions. This portrayal avoids simple villains and instead focuses on how systems fail when individuals choose safety over truth. The film's structure reinforces this theme. Events move forward not because of rage alone, but because of silence, hesitation, and compliance. Betrayal is quiet. Denial happens in passing. Responsibility is passed from one authority to another. This makes the story harder to dismiss as ancient cruelty. It feels uncomfortably familiar. By the time the crucifixion occurs, the viewer understands that the suffering is not only physical, it is the result of fear, institutional pressure, and moral avoidance. Gibson did not invent this interpretation, but he made it unavoidable. This approach explains both the devotion and the resistance the film inspired. For some viewers, it clarified the meaning of sacrifice in a way sermons never had. For others, it felt like an accusation, forcing them to confront discomfort they would rather avoid. Understanding this intention is essential before examining what happened next, because once the film's purpose became clear, resistance did not come only from critics, it came from the industry itself. Once the Passion of the Christ moved from concept to production, resistance became unavoidable. This resistance did not begin after the film's release. It started the moment Mel Gibson made it clear that he would not dilute the story to make it easier to accept. In Hollywood, that choice carried consequences. Religious films, particularly Christian ones, have long existed on the margins of the mainstream industry. They are often expected to be gentle, uplifting, or symbolic. Gibson rejected all three expectations. He chose a story rooted in suffering, moral failure, and physical reality. For many executives and studios, that made the project not only risky, but undesirable. Gibson quickly realized that support would be limited. Financing became difficult. Distribution was uncertain. Some industry figures openly questioned why he would attach his name to a project that could damage his reputation. Others expressed discomfort not just with the content, but with the seriousness of the message. This was not a film that could be marketed easily or consumed casually. What Gibson described later was not a single coordinated effort to stop the film, but a pattern of quiet resistance. Meetings that went nowhere, conversations that ended politely but led to closed doors. A sense that this story was unwelcome in a culture that preferred distance from religious intensity. The resistance was subtle, but consistent. Part of the discomfort came from the film's refusal to align with modern framing. It did not present Jesus as a vague moral teacher or symbolic figure. It presented him as a real person subjected to a real execution. That realism removed the option of neutrality. Viewers were forced to react, not observe. Another source of resistance was fear of controversy. Executives worried about public backlash, accusations of insensitivity, and potential social consequences. From a business perspective, those concerns were understandable. From Gibson's perspective, they were unavoidable. He believed that truth, if presented honestly, would always provoke reaction rather than compromise. Gibson chose independence. He financed the film himself and accepted full responsibility for its outcome. This decision insulated the production creatively, but it increased personal risk. If the film failed, the loss would be his alone. If it succeeded, the criticism would still be personal. When the film was released, the predicted controversy arrived quickly. Some critics dismissed it as excessive or regressive. Others accused it of promoting harmful interpretations of history. Certain organizations raised concerns even before audiences saw the film, based on script reviews and early reports. What is important here is not whether those concerns were valid in every case, but how quickly the narrative formed. The film was discussed as a cultural problem before it was widely experienced as a work of art. For Gibson, this confirmed what he had sensed during production, that the resistance was not only about content, but about discomfort with confronting suffering tied to faith. Despite this, the film reached audiences in a way few expected. Viewers responded emotionally, often deeply. Some described it as overwhelming. Others described it as clarifying. Many disagreed with aspects of the film while still acknowledging its impact. The box office success surprised the industry and challenged assumptions about audience appetite for serious religious material. This success did not erase the resistance. It intensified it. The film became impossible to ignore, and with that came stronger reactions on all sides. Gibson found himself at the center of debates about religion, history, responsibility, and representation. What is often overlooked is the personal toll of this period. Gibson has spoken about isolation, pressure, and the strain of carrying both creative control and public scrutiny. The film did not simply test his career, it tested his convictions. This section of the story matters because it shows that the backlash was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate refusal to make the story safe, and that refusal set the stage for deeper conversations, not only about the film, but about institutions, power, and accountability. Those conversations did not stop with Hollywood. They extended into the church itself, where Gibson would later confront truths that were even harder to accept. As discussions around the Passion of the Christ expanded, Mel Gibson's reflections moved beyond filmmaking and into deeply uncomfortable territory: the failure of religious institutions to protect the values they claim to uphold. This was not a topic he approached lightly. Gibson has consistently described his faith as central to his life, which made this confrontation personal rather than ideological. Gibson spoke openly about the damage caused when church leadership prioritizes reputation over accountability. Abuse scandals were not abstract headlines to him. They represented a betrayal of trust at the highest levels. What disturbed him most was not only the crimes themselves, but the systems that enabled silence, relocation, and protection of offenders instead of justice for victims. He acknowledged that for many believers, this reality creates confusion and disillusionment. The church is often viewed as a moral anchor, a place of safety and spiritual guidance. When that trust is violated, the harm extends far beyond individual cases. It fractures faith, weakens communities, and creates lasting skepticism, especially among those who are already struggling. Gibson's criticism did not reject Christianity itself. Instead, it drew a sharp distinction between faith and institution. He argued that belief can survive failure, but only if failure is acknowledged honestly. Denial, in his view, is what destroys credibility. When leadership refuses to confront wrongdoing, it pushes people away from the very message it claims to serve. He also expressed frustration with the lack of transparency and accountability within structures that operate beyond normal legal oversight. The Vatican is not just a religious center, it is a sovereign entity. That status, while historically rooted, complicates justice when internal systems protect authority rather than victims. Gibson saw this as a structural problem, not a spiritual one. Importantly, he did not present himself as an outsider attacking the church. He spoke as someone who felt betrayed by an institution he loved. That distinction matters. His criticism was not driven by hostility toward faith, but by anger at hypocrisy. For him, silence was not neutrality, it was participation. This perspective reframes how the Passion of the Christ is often discussed. The film's focus on institutional pressure, moral cowardice, and fear-driven decisions parallels Gibson's real-world concerns. Religious authorities in the film are shown as divided, some doubtful, some complicit, many afraid. That portrayal mirrors the failures Gibson later described in modern contexts. The point was not that institutions are inherently corrupt, but that they are vulnerable to the same weaknesses as individuals: fear, self-preservation, and denial. Without accountability, those weaknesses become systemic. Gibson argued that healing requires exposure, not concealment. This section of the story complicates simplistic interpretations of Gibson's work. It shows that his commitment to depicting suffering was not selective. He was willing to confront uncomfortable truths wherever he saw them, even when they implicated institutions tied to his own identity. Understanding this helps explain why the Passion of the Christ continues to provoke strong reactions. It is not only about ancient events. It reflects ongoing struggles between belief and power, truth and protection, repentance and denial. Next, it is necessary to examine how critics, scholars, and religious communities responded to the film itself, and why those reactions were so sharply divided. When The Passion of the Christ was released, it did not enter the public conversation quietly. It arrived already surrounded by expectation, suspicion, and debate. What followed was not a unified response, but a sharp division that revealed how differently people approach faith, history, and art. Some of the most respected film critics responded with serious attention rather than dismissal. They recognized that regardless of personal belief, the film was made with conviction and purpose. Several praised its technical craft, visual discipline, and emotional intensity. They noted that Gibson did not treat the story casually or cynically. The film demanded focus and emotional engagement, something rare in a media environment built around distraction. Others reacted strongly in the opposite direction. The most common criticism focused on the film's violence. Many argued that the suffering was excessive and unnecessary. For some viewers, the brutality became a barrier rather than a bridge to understanding. They questioned whether such intensity helped communicate meaning or simply overwhelmed the audience. Another major area of controversy involved historical responsibility. Jewish organizations and religious scholars expressed concern about how Jewish authorities were portrayed in the film. Their fear was not theoretical. For centuries, misinterpretations of the crucifixion story had been used to justify discrimination and violence against Jewish communities. Even the suggestion that a modern film might revive those narratives raised alarms. In response to these concerns, religious and academic committees reviewed the film's script and structure. Their conclusions acknowledged that the movie focused on a narrow group of leaders rather than an entire people. But they also warned that visual storytelling can shape perception more powerfully than footnotes or explanations. Images, once seen, cannot be easily qualified. This criticism placed Gibson in a difficult position. He maintained that his intent was not to assign collective blame, but to portray a specific historical moment shaped by political pressure and fear. He argued that Roman authority, not religious leadership alone, carried out the execution. Still, he acknowledged that intent does not always control interpretation. What made this debate particularly intense was that it extended beyond theology into modern identity and memory. For some, the film reopened wounds they believed had begun to heal. For others, it felt like an honest confrontation with a foundational story that had been avoided or diluted. At the same time, audience response told a different story. Millions of people around the world watched the film and reacted emotionally. Many described leaving theaters in silence. Others spoke about re-examining beliefs they had taken for granted. Some felt strengthened in faith. Others felt unsettled but reflective. This gap between critical debate and personal experience is important. It shows that the film functioned differently depending on the viewer's background. For some, it was a religious affirmation. For others, it was a moral challenge. For still others, it was a work of art that provoked discomfort without offering easy answers. What cannot be denied is the scale of its impact. The film became a cultural event, not just a cinematic release. It entered conversations about religion, violence, responsibility, and representation in ways few films ever do. Agreement was not required for engagement. In fact, disagreement fueled its longevity. This section of the story highlights why the Passion of the Christ remains relevant. It exposed deep divides not only about Jesus, but about how societies process pain, guilt, and accountability. It reminded audiences that powerful stories do not unite by pleasing everyone. They divide by forcing people to choose how they respond. To fully understand why this film affected so many people so deeply, it is necessary to look beyond the screen into what happened during its creation and why those experiences added another layer to its legacy. As intense as the passion of the Christ was on screen, the events behind the camera added another layer to its legacy. What occurred during production was not carefully planned symbolism or publicity. It was a series of physical hardships, unexpected incidents, and personal changes that deeply affected the people involved. The actor who carried the heaviest burden was Jim Caviezel, who portrayed Jesus. The role demanded more than performance. During filming, he suffered real physical injuries, including a dislocated shoulder while carrying the cross. In several scenes, the pain visible on screen was not acting. It was genuine. The production used practical effects whenever possible, and that decision came with consequences. The whipping scenes were particularly dangerous. Despite safety measures, Caviezel was struck accidentally during filming, causing real injury. These moments were not exaggerated later in editing. Gibson chose to leave them as they were, believing that authenticity mattered more than comfort. That choice again reflected the film's core philosophy. Suffering should not be simulated when it can be faced honestly. Caviezel also underwent significant physical transformation for the role. His appearance was altered to remove modern familiarity. Even small details, such as eye color and facial structure, were adjusted to avoid projecting contemporary assumptions onto an ancient figure. The goal was not to create a familiar hero, but a historically grounded presence. Beyond physical hardship, strange and unsettling incidents occurred on set. Members of the cast and crew reported lightning strikes during filming, including during the crucifixion scenes. While these events can be explained naturally, their timing left a strong impression. They created an atmosphere of seriousness that no one could ignore. Whether coincidence or chance, they reinforced the sense that this project was unlike any other. More significant than accidents were the personal changes experienced by several people involved. Some cast members spoke openly about shifts in belief and perspective. One actor who entered the project as a skeptic later described a profound change in his view of faith. These transformations were not part of any planned narrative. They emerged quietly, through prolonged exposure to the story and its demands. Even among crew members, stories circulated of renewed purpose and reflection. Long days spent filming suffering, silence, and loss had an effect. The work was emotionally exhausting, and that exhaustion forced people to confront their own beliefs, doubts, and assumptions. Mel Gibson later reflected that the most meaningful outcome of the film was not awards or financial success. It was the way it changed people. He spoke about moments of unexpected healing and renewed clarity among those involved, careful not to frame them as proof of anything, but unwilling to dismiss their significance. One visual moment in the film captured this philosophy clearly: the scene of Jesus being taken down from the cross and placed in his mother's arms. Gibson designed it as a deliberate echo of classical religious art, emphasizing sorrow without collapse, grief without despair. It became one of the most emotionally resonant moments for audiences worldwide. These behind-the-scenes experiences matter because they align with the film's message. The project demanded endurance, honesty, and vulnerability. It did not protect its participants from discomfort. In that sense, the making of the film mirrored its content. Understanding this helps explain why the film continues to be discussed with such intensity. It was not a detached production. It required something from everyone involved. And that demand left marks, some physical, some emotional, and some lasting far beyond the final cut. In the final section of the content, we turn to what Gibson revealed next: his vision for a new project, focused not on suffering alone, but on meaning, belief, and what follows after death. Toward the end of his conversation with Joe Rogan, Mel Gibson shifted focus. He moved away from controversy, criticism, and even suffering, and spoke about what comes next, not just narratively, but existentially. For Gibson, the crucifixion was never the end of the story. The real question, and the harder one, was resurrection. He explained that suffering alone does not explain Christianity. Many people suffer. Many die unjustly. What separates this story is the claim that death did not have the final word. Gibson acknowledged that this claim is where belief becomes difficult, even unreasonable. For many modern listeners, a resurrection cannot be proven the way historical facts are proven. It demands a different kind of engagement. Gibson did not speak about resurrection as a comforting idea. He framed it as a disruptive one. If resurrection is true, then death is not merely an ending, it is a passage. That idea unsettles both believers and skeptics because it changes how life itself is understood. It raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility, purpose, and truth. He also rejected the idea that faith should be inherited without examination. Gibson admitted that for years he believed because he was raised to believe. Over time, that was no longer enough. He began asking why people would endure persecution, torture, and death for a claim they knew to be false. His conclusion was not simplistic certainty, but conviction born of reflection. This is the moment that affected Rogan most deeply, not because he accepted the claim, but because Gibson was not asking for agreement. He was asking for honesty. He suggested that many people dismiss faith not because they have disproven it, but because they have never allowed themselves to confront its implications seriously. Gibson also hinted at a future film project centered on this question, not a conventional sequel, but a deeper exploration of what resurrection means across time, belief systems, and moral struggle. He described years of research, discussion, and revision. The goal was not spectacle, but coherence, to show how one event, if true, reshapes everything that follows. He emphasized that this project was not driven by success or recognition. In fact, he expected resistance again. But for Gibson, the pattern was familiar. Meaningful stories provoke discomfort. They resist simplification. They demand engagement rather than passive consumption. What makes this section of the story important is that it reframes everything that came before. The suffering shown in the Passion of the Christ was not meant to stand alone. It was meant to point forward. Without resurrection, the film would be unbearable. With it, suffering becomes a question rather than a conclusion. Gibson did not claim to have all the answers. What he offered instead was a challenge. If the resurrection claim is dismissed too quickly, what assumptions are being protected? Comfort, control, distance. And if it is taken seriously, even hypothetically, what does that demand of the individual? This was not theology delivered from a pulpit. It was a filmmaker explaining why he could not let the story end at death. And in that explanation, the conversation stopped being about cinema altogether. The Passion of the Christ was never just a film about the past. Through Mel Gibson's choices, the resistance he faced, the controversy it sparked, and the reflections he later shared with Joe Rogan, it became a mirror held up to the present. It exposed how we respond to suffering, how institutions protect themselves, how truth creates discomfort, and how easily we turn away when a story demands too much from us. Gibson's journey shows that faith is not sustained by comfort, applause, or consensus. It is tested by resistance, doubt, and honesty. The film forced audiences and its creator to confront pain without escape and to ask whether meaning exists beyond it. That is why it still provokes debate years later. The final question is simple, but not easy. If a story about sacrifice, truth, and resurrection still unsettles us this deeply, what is it asking us to face in ourselves? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story challenges you most? And why do you think it still resonates today?